Hi, I'm Todd Petter, and I'm here with my colleague in the NCAA Research Department, Nicole Bracken. Our department's primary role is to support the membership through a wide range of research activities. The finances of intercollegiate athletics is one of the many topics that we research.
As we release our annual revenues and expenses reports, which are written by Professor Dan Folks from Transylvania University, we're here to share some of our research findings, provide some basic information about college athletics finances, and perhaps add some interesting and relevant data to the overall discussion.
Our goals here are to share with you information about the size and scope of intercollegiate athletics. How big is the enterprise? The types of expenditures that campuses make. Where does the money go? The range of budgets within Division I institutions. Are all athletics departments equal? And finally, recent trends in the growth of FBS revenues and expenses. Is the financial model sustainable? One of the most basic questions is how big is the enterprise of college sports? Our most recent data indicated that NCAA institutions spent about $12 billion on athletics in 2010-11. They generated about $6 billion in revenue directly from athletics endeavors, which includes things like ticket sales, television rights, alumni contributions, and other revenues from sources outside the university.
Obviously, $6 billion in annual revenue is big business, but let's put that into the perspective of some other large organizations that are sports-related. Annual revenues for the NBA were about 25% less than those in intercollegiate athletics, but the NFL was about 50% more. Organizations like Adidas and Nike have annual generated revenues that are 3 to 4 times higher than those seen in all of intercollegiate athletics.
Perhaps a more relevant economic context to consider is higher education in the United States. NCAA member institutions spent about $330 billion in 2010-11 educating their students. Thus, the $12 billion spent on intercollegiate athletics represents just over 3.5% of total spending by NCAA colleges and universities. When you factor out the $6 billion of revenues that are generated by athletics, that proportion shrinks to less than 2%.
So, where does that money go? Last year, NCAA Division I and II institutions provided more than $2.3 billion in direct financial aid to their student athletes, what most people call athletic scholarships. There was another $2.9 billion that went to other items that directly benefited the student-athlete experience. Expenses like travel, equipment, facilities, and academic services. So approximately half of all expenditures go to direct benefits for student-athletes. The rest of the spending goes to compensation for head and assistant coaches, administrative compensation, and other operating expenses.
Given the attention paid to college athletics and the money that is spent, many people assume that most institutions are making large profits on intercollegiate athletics. The fact is that last year, out of almost 1,100 NCAA institutions, only 23 generated more revenue than their overall athletics expenses. That number has ranged from a minimum of 14 institutions during the recent recession to a maximum of 25 over the past several years. Any way you cut it, a very small portion of NCAA institutions are actually generating a profit. The data we've presented so far relates to the entire NCAA membership. We now want to take a closer look at what goes on among the 345 Division I institutions. We'll compare trends in revenues and expenses across the 3 Division I subdivisions, the Football Bowl subdivision, FBS, Football Championship subdivision, FCS, and Division I institutions that don't sponsor football.
Are all institutions in Division I on similar financial footing? Well, the simple answer is no. As you can see from this graphic, there's a large and growing difference between the revenues that are generated at the median FBS program versus those in the other subdivisions. In the most recent year, the median FBS institution generated over $38 million in revenue as opposed to the less than $3.5 million in the other 2 subdivisions. The story is much the same when you look at the expense side of the ledger. The median FBS institution spent about $50 million in 2010-11 versus the $12 to $13 million for the other 2 groups. What may be most interesting, though, is that even with the large differences in revenues and expenses that we observe, the overall amount of money provided to the athletic department from the university is remarkably similar across all 3 divisions. In the most recent year, the median was around $10 million for all 3 subdivisions. In some sense, one could argue that this $10 million is the value that these institutions have placed on having a Division I athletics program.
Next, we want to focus a bit more attention on the very largest athletic departments, those at the FBS level. It is these schools that garner the most media attention and about which much concern has been noted related to growth in revenues and expenses, and especially the sustainability of that growth. As you can see from this graphic, expenses have always been slightly higher than generated revenues at the median, which is why most athletic departments are not making a profit. However, growth of generated revenues and expenses over the past 8 years has been very similar. In that time frame, expenses and generated revenues grew by about 70 to 75% each. A more prevalent concern has been that the rate of growth in athletics expenses has been outpacing the rate of growth in overall university budgets. This graph shows the difference in the growth rate of athletics expenses versus institutional expenses over the past 8 years. When we first began analyzing these data in the mid-2000s, it was clear that athletics expenses were indeed growing more rapidly than institutional expenses by rates as high as 5 to 6% per year. However, the growth rates have been much more similar, within a percentage point, over the last few years. This is a statistic that bears watching closely over the next few years to ensure that athletics expenses remain in line with broader institutional spending patterns.
Finally, we want to highlight some very large differences within just the FBS in terms of size of athletics programs. Obviously, such differences have large impacts on the competitive equity within this subdivision of 120 institutions. This graph shows trends in median generated revenues among 4 quartiles of FBS institutions. As you can see, there is currently an $80 million difference in the median generated revenues between the highest and lowest quartiles in FBS. Some schools generated almost $150 million in revenues in the most recent year. Even between the top 2 quartiles, there is a $40 million gap in median generated revenues. 8 years ago, that gap was only about $20 million. On the expense side, the median gap between top and bottom quartiles is over $60 million, with the top schools spending over $130 million. The gap between the top 2 quartiles has grown by $25 million over the past 8 years. Even the gap between the top 2 quartiles has doubled in that time. It is certainly important to ponder whether this type of disparity is sustainable both financially and competitively in the long run for institutions within the same NCAA subdivision.
So, what have we learned? One thing we have seen in the data is that although intercollegiate athletics are a large endeavor, they are still a small percentage of overall university budgets.
In terms of athletic spending, about half of the spending directly benefits the student athletes, while the other half provides infrastructure for the overall student-athlete experience.
We see there is a large disparity of budgets, even within teams who compete on the same field of play.
These disparities should lead to a continued examination of the sustainability of this model.
We hope that this brief presentation has provided some useful information on intercollegiate athletics finances and raised some important issues for thought and discussion. We encourage much more dialogue on this topic based on this data.
For more of that data, please visit the NCAA website and look for our newly released annual revenues and expenses and gender equity reports for all 3 divisions. Thank you for your time.